The evening sky painted streaks of orange and purple across the horizon as the last preparations for the charity gala were underway at Blake Carter's luxurious penthouse. At 42, Blake had built his fortune in real estate, transforming abandoned buildings into gleaming towers that now defined the city's skyline. His annual charity event had become the talk of the town, a place where the elite gathered to be seen and occasionally to write checks for worthy causes. Blake stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, admiring his reflection in the glass. His tailored navy suit hugged his athletic frame perfectly, the result of daily sessions with his personal trainer. He ran a hand through his salt and pepper hair and smiled with satisfaction. Everything was in place. The champagne was chilling. The catering staff moved efficiently through the space, and his newest acquisition, a rare Steinway grand piano, gleamed under the soft lighting in the center of his living room. "Is everything to your liking, Mr. Carter?" asked his event coordinator, a nervous young man clutching an iPad. "Almost," Blake replied, his eyes still fixed on the piano. "Tell me again how much that beauty cost." "Just over 300,000, sir. It belonged to a renowned concert pianist from Vienna." Blake nodded approvingly. He didn't particularly care about music, but he did care about exclusivity and the status that came with owning things others couldn't have. The piano was just another trophy in his collection, like the original Picasso in his bedroom or the vintage cars gathering dust in his garage. The first guests would arrive in 30 minutes. Blake turned away from the window and walked toward the kitchen, where the catering team was putting final touches on elaborate appetizer trays. He barely noticed the cleaning staff finishing up their work, people in gray uniforms who moved quietly around the edges of the room, emptying trash bins and wiping down surfaces. Among them was Lena, a 34-year-old woman who had been working for the cleaning company for almost 4 years. Unlike her colleagues who kept their eyes down, Lena couldn't help glancing repeatedly at the piano. Her fingers twitched slightly at her sides as she dusted a nearby bookshelf, her movement slowing whenever the grand piano came into view. "You people need to be gone before the guests arrive," Blake called out to the cleaning crew, his voice sharp. "And don't touch the piano. It's worth more than you'll make in a lifetime." Lena flinched at his words but said nothing. Her supervisor nodded quickly and ushered the team toward the service elevator. But just as Lena was about to leave, the supervisor's phone rang. "There's a spill in the upstairs bathroom," he told her after hanging up. "Take care of it quickly and then come down. Use the service stairs when you're done so you don't disturb the guests." Lena nodded and grabbed her cleaning cart, making her way to the upstairs level of the penthouse. As she cleaned, she could hear the first guests arriving, their laughter and conversation drifting up the stairs along with the soft music of a hired string quartet. By the time she finished, the party was in full swing. Lena knew she should leave immediately through the service stairs as instructed, but something pulled her toward the main floor again. She told herself she just wanted one more look at that piano before she left. Keeping to the shadows, she made her way down the main staircase, careful to remain unnoticed. The crowd had grown, with at least 100 people filling the massive living area. Women in designer gowns and men in tuxedos mingled with champagne glasses in hand, their jewelry catching the light with every gesture. Blake stood near the piano, surrounded by a group of admirers. His voice carried above the crowd as he recounted the story of how he'd outbid a famous musician for the Steinway. "He called me afterward, practically begging to buy it from me." Blake laughed, taking a swig of champagne. "I told him he should have bid higher." His audience laughed appreciatively, hanging on his every word. Emboldened by their attention and the alcohol, Blake placed a hand on the piano's glossy surface. "You know," he said, his voice growing louder, "I've never even played a note on this thing." $300,000 for a fancy piece of furniture. More laughter followed. A woman in a red dress touched his arm flirtatiously. "Surely you bought it for someone to play," she suggested. "Perhaps you could hire a pianist for your next event?" Blake's eyes gleamed with sudden mischief. He set his glass down on top of the piano and raised his hands for attention. The room gradually quieted. "I have a better idea," he announced. "This piano is supposedly one of the finest instruments ever made. So here's my offer. If anyone here tonight can play this piano and truly do it justice, I'll marry them on the spot." The room erupted in laughter and scattered applause. Someone shouted, "Better get my sheet music," causing another wave of amusement to ripple through the crowd. "I'm serious. Blake insisted, though his smirk suggested otherwise. Man, woman, doesn't matter. Play like a master and you'll get all of this. He gestured grandly around the penthouse. God knows I've tried marriage twice already. Maybe third time's the charm. From her position near the service entrance, Lena watched with a mixture of disgust and fascination. She knew men like Blake, wealthy, entitled, treating everything and everyone as commodities to be acquired or discarded. And yet she couldn't tear her eyes away from the piano. It had been so long since she'd played. Before coming to America, Lena had studied at the National Conservatory in her home country. For 12 years, she had dedicated her life to music, practicing 8 hours a day until her fingers cramped and her back ached. Her professors had called her gifted, promising. She had performed in prestigious concert halls across Europe, even touring briefly with an orchestra when she was just 20. Then came the revolution, the economic collapse, the desperate flight to America with nothing but a suitcase of clothes and a few family photographs. Her degree meant nothing here. Her experience meant nothing. For years, she had avoided pianos altogether, the pain of her lost dreams too much to bear. A server passed by with a tray of champagne, and Lena pressed herself further into the shadows. She should leave. This wasn't her world, yet her feet refused to move as Blake continued his theatrical challenge. No takers? He taunted, scanning the room. Come on, surely someone here has had piano lessons. 10 million in assets, a penthouse with a view of the park, and all you have to do is play. A young man in a tuxedo stepped forward. I took lessons for 8 years, he said, slightly slurring his words. Let me give it a shot. Blake gestured dramatically toward the piano. Be my guest. The crowd parted as the young man sat down on the bench. He flexed his fingers dramatically before launching into a clumsy rendition of Furelise. After hitting several wrong notes, he gave up with a sheepish grin. Sorry, it's been a while, he admitted as he rejoined his laughing friends. Anyone else? Blake challenged. Or should I take this to mean I'm still the most eligible bachelor in the room? An older woman tried next, playing a simple tune that one might teach a child. Then a middle-aged man attempted a jazz piece but kept losing the rhythm. With each attempt, Lena felt something building inside her, an indignation, a fire she hadn't felt in years. These people were treating the magnificent instrument like a toy, and Blake was treating it like a prop in his egotistical performance. Well, I think we've established that my piano will remain unmastered tonight, Blake declared, reclaiming the attention of the room. Perhaps I should have it converted into a bar. At least then it would serve a purpose. The suggestion was met with appreciative laughter. Blake raised his glass in a toast, clearly enjoying his role as the center of attention. Lena didn't realize she had stepped out of the shadows until several heads turned in her direction. In her gray uniform with the cleaning company logo, she stood out starkly against the backdrop of evening gowns and tailored suits. Excuse me, a server whispered urgently, approaching her. Staff are supposed to use the service entrance. Mr. Carter doesn't want... But Lena didn't hear the rest. Her eyes were locked on the piano, and for the first time in 7 years she felt her fingers aching to play. Without consciously deciding to do so, she found herself moving forward, past surprised guests who stepped aside with raised eyebrows and curious glances. Blake noticed her approach and frowned. I believe the cleaning crew was supposed to be gone by now, he said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. The service elevator is that way. He pointed dismissively toward the kitchen. Lena stopped a few feet from him, her heart pounding in her chest. I heard your challenge, she said, her voice quiet but steady. A beat of silence fell over the nearby crowd as they realized what was happening. Then Blake laughed, a sharp, incredulous sound. Oh, this is rich, he said, looking around to make sure others were appreciating the moment. The cleaner wants to try the piano challenge. He gestured toward the instrument with exaggerated courtesy. By all means. This should be entertaining. Someone snickered. A woman whispered something to her companion. Lena felt heat rising to her cheeks, but she kept her eyes on the piano as she moved forward and carefully sat down on the bench. The polished keys gleamed under the soft lighting, familiar yet strange after so many years. Lena placed her hands gently on the keys, feeling the cool ivory beneath her fingertips. She closed her eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, and began to play. The first notes of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major filled the room, floating through the air like a forgotten dream returning. Lena's fingers moved with a certainty that surprised even her, muscle memory taking over where conscious thought faltered. Behind her, the laughter and whispers died away. The clink of glasses stilled, and somewhere in the sudden silence, Blake Carter stood frozen, the mocking smile slipping from his face as the cleaning woman played his $300,000 piano, like it was an extension of her very soul. The music flowed from Lena's fingers as naturally as breathing. Years seemed to fall away as the familiar notes of Chopin filled Blake Carter's penthouse. Her shoulders relaxed, her posture transformed, and for a moment, she forgot where she was. Forgot the cleaning uniform, forgot the stairs, forgot everything except the music that had once been her entire world. The party guests stood transfixed. Some had closed their eyes, swaying slightly to the haunting melody. Others watched Lena with expressions ranging from surprise to outright disbelief. No one spoke. No one moved toward the bar or checked their phones. The room had fallen under a spell, cast by the unlikely magician seated at the piano. As the final notes of the nocturne faded, Lena paused, her hands hovering above the keys. The silence that followed was profound, a collective held breath. Then, without planning to, she began again, this time with Rachmaninoff's Prelude in G minor, her fingers dancing across the keys with increasing confidence. The piece was technically demanding, full of complex passages that separated casual players from true pianists. And Lena attacked it with a passion that had been dormant for too long. Blake Carter stood closest to the piano, his champagne glass forgotten in his hand. His expression had shifted from mocking amusement to utter shock. He watched Lena's hands that had been dusting his bookshelves less than an hour ago, now commanding his expensive piano with authority and skill he couldn't begin to comprehend. The woman before him seemed completely different from the quiet cleaner he'd dismissed earlier. Her face was transformed, eyes half closed in concentration, a slight smile playing on her lips as she navigated a particularly difficult passage with apparent ease. When Lena finished the second piece, the spell broke. The room erupted in spontaneous applause, genuine, enthusiastic, and tinged with amazement. People turned to each other with wide eyes and disbelieving smiles. "Who is she?" whispered the woman in the red dress who had been flirting with Blake earlier. No one had an answer. Lena opened her eyes, suddenly remembering where she was. Color rushed to her cheeks as she became aware of the attention focused on her. She stood quickly, smoothing down her uniform with trembling hands. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, though no one could quite understand what she was apologizing for. "I should go." As she turned to leave, Blake finally found his voice. "Wait," he called out, louder than he'd intended. The room quieted again, all eyes moving between him and Lena. He cleared his throat, uncomfortable with the scrutiny but unwilling to let the moment pass. "Where did you learn to play like that?" Lena hesitated, one hand resting lightly on the piano as if reluctant to break contact with it. "The National Conservatory," she answered. "Back in my country." "You're a professional pianist?" someone in the crowd asked. "I was," Lena replied, her voice gaining strength as she spoke of her past for the first time in years. "Before I came to America." Blake set his glass down carefully on a side table and approached her. Gone was the arrogant smirk, replaced by an expression of genuine curiosity. "What happened?" he asked, and though the question was personal, there was no mockery in his tone. Lena looked around at the sea of interested faces and felt strangely calm. These people with their expensive clothes and privileged lives were waiting to hear her story. For once they were seeing her, really seeing her. "Revolution happened," she said simply. "Economic collapse. I left with whatever I could carry." She glanced down at her uniform with a small, rueful smile. "Music degrees don't translate well when you're starting over in a new country." A middle-aged woman stepped forward from the crowd. "I'm on the board of the City Symphony," she said, extending a business card. "We should talk." Before Lena could respond, others moved forward. A music professor, the owner of a prestigious piano bar, a record producer. Suddenly, she was surrounded by people asking questions, offering cards, making suggestions. The rapid shift from invisibility to the center of attention was overwhelming. Blake watched this unfold with an unreadable expression. The challenge he'd issued in jest, "Play this piano and I'll marry you," hung awkwardly in the air, neither acknowledged nor forgotten. He caught snippets of conversation around him. Did you see Carter's face when she started playing? I'd pay good money to see that performance again. From cleaner to concert pianist, it's like something from a movie. His annual charity gala, normally remembered for its extravagance and the social connections made, would this year be remembered for something entirely different? Blake wasn't sure how he felt about that. After what seemed like an eternity of handshakes and conversations, the crowd around Lena thinned as guests returned to their drinks and conversations. Though the mood of the party had undeniably shifted, many people glanced back at the piano periodically, as if hoping for another impromptu concert. Lena stood alone by the instrument, clutching several business cards and looking slightly dazed. Her supervisor would be wondering where she was. She had crossed an invisible line tonight, stepped out of her assigned role into something undefined. Blake approached her again, 2 fresh glasses of champagne in his hands. He offered one to her with a gesture that somehow managed to be both apologetic and tentative. "I think you've earned this," he said. Lena accepted the glass cautiously. "Thank you," she said, "but I really should get back to work. My team will be looking for me." "I think we can make an exception tonight," Blake replied. "Consider yourself off duty." He paused, searching for the right words. "That was extraordinary. Where did you learn those pieces?" The question opened a floodgate. As they stood by the piano, Lena found herself telling Blake about her childhood in a small apartment where a battered upright piano had been her only escape. She told him about the scholarship to the conservatory at 13, the brutal practice schedule, the competition she'd won, and finally, the touring position with the National Symphony that had seemed like the fulfillment of all her dreams. Then everything fell apart, she said, the champagne loosening her tongue. Political instability, violence in the streets. The symphony disbanded. My parents insisted I leave the country. She took a sip from her glass. "I haven't played in 7 years. Not really. Sometimes I practice on a keyboard app on my phone, but it's not the same." Blake listened without interrupting, a skill that seemed unnatural to him. When she finished speaking, he ran a hand through his hair, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. "Well," he said finally, with a forced lightness, "I suppose I should honor my promise." Lena blinked at him in confusion. "My offer," Blake reminded her, gesturing toward the piano. "Play this piano and I'll marry you." A startled laugh escaped her. "You can't be serious." "Of course not," he admitted with a rueful smile. "It was a stupid joke. But I do owe you something for making me look like a complete fool in front of half the city's elite." "That wasn't my intention," Lena said quickly. "No, but it was well deserved." Blake's smile faded into something more thoughtful. "You have an incredible gift. It shouldn't be wasted cleaning other people's homes." A voice called out from across the room. Lena's supervisor, looking frantic and apologetic as he approached. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Carter," he began. "I had no idea she was still here." Blake cut him off with a raised hand. "Everything's fine," he said firmly. "In fact, Ms." He turned to Lena questioningly. "Petrova," she supplied. "Lena Petrova." "Ms. Petrova has been entertaining my guests," Blake continued smoothly. "I'd appreciate it if you could manage without her for the rest of the evening." The supervisor looked bewildered but nodded quickly. "Of course, sir. Whatever you say." He retreated, casting a confused glance at Lena as he went. The party continued around them, but it was as if they stood in a small bubble of quiet. Blake swirled the champagne in his glass, seemingly deep in thought. "I have a proposal," he said finally. "Not marriage," he added quickly, seeing her expression. "Something more practical." "I'm listening," Lena said cautiously. "This piano deserves to be played by someone who understands it. And you deserve to play something better than a phone app." He met her eyes directly. "I host gatherings here at least twice a month. Would you consider being my regular pianist? Paid, of course." "Well paid." Lena stared at him, searching for the catch. "Why would you do that?" Blake shrugged, looking almost embarrassed. "Let's call it making amends for being an insufferable snob. Or maybe I just want to impress my friends with my personal concert pianist. Either way, you'd be doing me a favor." Before she could respond, he added, "And I have connections with several music schools in the city. If you're interested in teaching, I could make some introductions." Lena's grip tightened on her champagne glass. The offer seemed too good to be true. A chance to return to music, to be seen as an artist again rather than just a cleaner. And yet pride made her hesitate. I don't need charity, she said carefully. It's not charity when you have something valuable to offer, Blake countered. I'm a businessman, Ms. Petrova. I recognize talent when I see it and I know how to invest in it. He extended his hand. So do we have a deal? Lena looked at his outstretched hand, the manicured nails, the expensive watch on his wrist, and then at her own hands, the hands of a pianist that had been cleaning toilets and dusting shelves for years. Something shifted inside her, a certainty she hadn't felt in a long time. She took his hand and shook it firmly. We have a deal, Mr. Carter. And somewhere in the penthouse, someone raised a glass and called for another song. 3 weeks had passed since the night of Blake Carter's charity gala, and Lena's life had shifted in ways she was still struggling to comprehend. She stood in the elevator of his luxury building, dressed not in her cleaning uniform, but in a simple black dress she'd bought specially for her new role as Blake's resident pianist. The label made her smile, part amusement, part disbelief that this was actually happening. Her first official performance was tonight. Blake was hosting a dinner for some business associates, and he'd asked her to provide background music during cocktails and after the meal. The pay for this single evening was more than she'd make in 2 days of cleaning houses. The elevator doors opened directly into Blake's penthouse foyer. The space looked different in the early evening light, warmer somehow, with soft lamps glowing and fresh flowers arranged in tall vases. Blake himself appeared from the kitchen, sleeves rolled up and a dish towel slung over his shoulder. You're early, he said by way of greeting, but his tone was friendly. I wanted to practice a bit before everyone arrives, Lena explained, gesturing toward the Steinway that had started this whole unlikely situation. Help yourself, Blake replied. I'm finishing up with the caterers. Apparently, when you're paying this much, you get to micromanage the hors d'oeuvres. Lena set down her small bag and moved to the piano. Over the past weeks, she'd come here several times to practice. Strange, quiet afternoons when Blake was at work, and she had the magnificent instrument all to herself. Each time she'd remembered more of who she used to be, the musician gradually emerging from beneath years of forced dormancy. She settled on the bench and began to warm up with a Chopin etude, her fingers dancing lightly over the keys. The sound of pots and voices from the kitchen faded as she lost herself in the familiar patterns. Blake appeared in the doorway, leaning against the frame and listening. He no longer looked surprised when she played, but there was still something in his expression, a kind of wonder, perhaps, that made Lena feel both proud and shy. Your guests will be impressed, she said, finishing the piece with a flourish. They're hard to impress, but I'm betting you'll manage it. Blake checked his watch. They'll start arriving in about 30 minutes. There's food in the kitchen if you want something before you play. Thank you, but I'm too nervous to eat, Lena admitted. Blake studied her for a moment. You've performed for actual concert halls full of people. 6 boring real estate developers shouldn't scare you. That was a different lifetime, she said quietly, and fear isn't always rational. Something in her tone made Blake cross the room and sit in the armchair nearest the piano. Tell me something, he said. If the revolution hadn't happened, where do you think you'd be now? The question caught Lena off guard. She looked down at her hands, considering. I'd probably be teaching at the conservatory, she said finally. Maybe still performing with the symphony. I was good but not quite soloist material. And here in America? Before this. He gestured vaguely between them, encompassing whatever strange arrangement they had fallen into. I had plans, Lena said, a defensive edge creeping into her voice. I was taking online courses in business administration, saving for a better apartment. The cleaning job was supposed to be temporary, but you never played, Blake pressed. Why not? There must be pianos in community centers, churches. Lena shook her head. You don't understand. Playing was who I was, when I couldn't be that person anymore. She trailed off, searching for words. It was easier to put it all behind me than to have just pieces of it. Blake nodded slowly. Like a bad breakup. Sometimes a clean cut heals better. Something like that, Lena agreed, surprised by his insight. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the catering staff, who began setting up a bar and arranging platters. Blake excused himself to change, leaving Lena alone at the piano again. She used the remaining time to practice the jazz standards and classical pieces she'd selected for the evening. The first guests arrived precisely at 7. Lena watched from her position at the piano as Blake transformed into the perfect host. charming, attentive, his earlier thoughtfulness replaced by a more polished persona. He introduced her simply as Lena, an extraordinary pianist, offering no explanation of how he'd found her. The guests nodded politely, but were clearly more interested in their cocktails and conversation than in who would be providing their entertainment. As they gathered in small groups, Lena began to play, soft background music that floated beneath their discussions of property values and investment opportunities. Occasionally, someone would glance her way with mild appreciation, but for the most part, she was furniture, like the Steinway itself, an expensive accessory to the evening. The dinner portion of the evening took place in the formal dining room, giving Lena a break. She slipped out onto the balcony, grateful for the cool night air. The city spread out below her, a tapestry of lights and movement. Somewhere down there was her tiny apartment, her roommate probably watching TV or studying for her nursing exams. Two different worlds, and somehow Lena was caught between them. Not a bad view, is it? She turned to find Blake standing in the doorway holding 2 plates of food. "Thought you might be hungry by now," he said, offering her one of the plates. "The chef would be offended if you didn't try his roasted duck." "Thank you," Lena said, taking the plate. "Shouldn't you be with your guests?" "They're discussing the tax benefits of opportunity zones," Blake replied with a grimace. I needed a break before my face froze in that interested expression. He demonstrated the look, eyebrows slightly raised, mouth curved in an attentive smile, making Lena laugh. They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes, watching the city below. "They don't really hear you playing," Blake said suddenly. "I wanted to apologize for that," Lena shrugged. "It's fine. That's what background music is supposed to be. Background. Still, you deserve a more appreciative audience. I'm getting paid very well to be ignored," Lena pointed out with a small smile. "There are worse jobs." Blake set his empty plate on a side table. "Next week is different," he said. "It's a fundraiser for the Arts Education Foundation I support. Musicians, gallery owners, people who might actually recognize what they're hearing when you play." Lena felt a flutter of both excitement and apprehension. "You didn't mention that before? Would you have agreed if I had?" Blake asked shrewdly. "Probably not," she admitted. "Hence my strategic omission." He grinned, unapologetic. "Besides, the woman from the symphony board will be there. The one who gave you her card that first night. She's been asking about you." Before Lena could respond, the balcony door opened wider and one of the dinner guests stepped out, a tall man with silver hair and an expensive watch that caught the light as he lit a cigar. "There you are." "Carter," he said, nodding briefly at Lena. "We're ready to discuss the riverfront project whenever you are." "Be right there." "Tom." Blake's voice had shifted back to its public version, smooth, confident, slightly louder than necessary. The man retreated inside, trailing cigar smoke. Blake turned back to Lena with a rueful expression. "Duty calls. They'll be wrapping up dinner soon. Would you mind playing again?" "That's what I'm here for," Lena said, picking up her plate. "I'll start in 5 minutes." Back at the piano, Lena watched as the dinner guests returned to the living room, now louder and more animated after wine and food. She began with some gentle Debussy, then transitioned to jazz standards that complemented the mellow mood of the after-dinner drinks. One of the guests, a younger man with glasses who had been quiet during the earlier part of the evening, drifted closer to the piano. He listened intently for a while, then caught Lena's eye. "Bill Evans?" he asked as she finished a piece. Lena nodded, pleased that someone had recognized it. "I played a bit in college," he explained. "Never anything like what you're doing, though." "You're really good." "Thank you," she said, and meant it. "Play something else?" he requested. "Something classical, maybe?" Lena glanced around the room. The other guests were engaged in conversation, paying little attention. Blake was showing something on his phone to 2 of the men, gesturing enthusiastically. She turned back to the keys and began Liszt's Liebestraum, her fingers finding the delicate opening notes with practiced ease. The conversation in the room gradually died away as the music swelled. Lena didn't notice at first, lost in the familiar rises and falls of the piece, the way it built from tender beginnings to passionate crescendos. It was only when she reached the final, gentle conclusion that she realized the room had fallen completely silent. She looked up to find every face turned toward her, expressions ranging from surprise to genuine emotion. The young man with glasses had tears in his eyes. Even the older gentleman with the cigar was watching her with newfound interest. "Good God," someone murmured. "Where did you find her, Blake?" Lena met Blake's gaze across the room. He was smiling, not his polished host smile, but something more genuine. He raised his glass to her in a small private toast. For the remainder of the evening, Lena was no longer background music. Guests approached the piano between pieces, making requests, asking questions about her training, her technique. The business talk had been temporarily forgotten in favor of music appreciation. Even Blake seemed surprised by the shift in atmosphere. As the last guests departed near midnight, Blake closed the door behind them and leaned against it with a tired sigh. "Well," he said, "that wasn't the evening I expected." "I'm sorry if I disrupted your business discussions," Lena said. Gathering her sheet music, Blake laughed. "Are you kidding? Tom Wilson just agreed to partner on the Riverfront project, and he's been stonewalling me for months. He said, and I quote, 'Anyone who can find talent like that has an eye for potential.'" He crossed the room and sat beside her on the piano bench. "I think you just made me a lot of money, Lena Petrova." Their shoulders were almost touching. Lena could smell his cologne, something expensive and subtle. The evening had left her feeling strangely euphoric, as if she'd remembered how to breathe after years of shallow inhalations. "Same time next week, then?" she asked, trying to sound professional despite the odd fluttering in her chest. "Absolutely," Blake replied, "but maybe we should talk about expanding your role." He turned to face her more directly. "How would you feel about a real concert? Here, for people who would actually appreciate what you can do?" Lena's heart skipped. "You can't be serious." "I'm always serious about good investments," Blake said, but his eyes were smiling. "And you, Lena Petrova, might be the best investment I've ever made." The day of the concert arrived with unseasonably warm spring sunshine streaming through the windows of Blake's penthouse. Lena stood in what had been a rarely used guest room, but was now temporarily transformed into a dressing area for her. A full-length mirror had been brought in, along with a comfortable chair and a small table holding a vase of fresh flowers. On the bed lay a garment bag containing a dress Blake had insisted on having sent over. "It's part of the performance," he'd explained when she'd protested. "Like costumes for a play, the audience expects a certain look." Lena unzipped the bag now, her breath catching as she revealed a midnight blue gown, with a subtle shimmer that caught the light as she lifted it. It was elegant without being flashy, perfectly suited to a classical pianist. She wondered how he'd known exactly what would be appropriate, then remembered the stylist who had visited last week to take her measurements, asking detailed questions about her preferences and comfort. As she slipped the dress on, Lena could hardly recognize herself in the mirror. The woman staring back at her looked like the concert pianist she might have become if life had followed a different path. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine that this was normal, that she regularly performed in beautiful venues, wearing beautiful clothes for people who appreciated music. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Lena, are you decent?" Blake's voice came through the door. "Yes, come in," she called, smoothing the dress nervously. Blake stepped into the room, already dressed in a perfectly tailored tuxedo. He stopped abruptly when he saw her, a smile spreading slowly across his face. "Well," he said simply, "we've come a long way from cleaning uniforms, haven't we?" Lena laughed, some of her tension breaking. "The dress is beautiful." "Thank you. You're welcome." Blake seemed almost shy suddenly, running a hand through his carefully styled hair. "The caterers are setting up. Guests will start arriving in about an hour." He hesitated, then added, "Are you ready for this?" The question held more weight than its simple words suggested. Lena turned back to the mirror, meeting her own eyes. "I think so," she said, "though I keep waiting for someone to tell me there's been a mistake, that I should get back to dusting the bookshelves." "No mistake," Blake assured her. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. "I have something for you." "A good luck charm, you could say." Lena accepted the box cautiously. Inside was a delicate silver bracelet with a tiny piano charm. It was tasteful and understated, not ostentatious or inappropriately personal. "It's lovely," she said, genuinely touched by the gesture. Blake took the bracelet and fastened it around her wrist. "I know professional musicians usually don't wear jewelry when they play. but this is small enough that it shouldn't get in your way." Their eyes met in the mirror, and something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement of how strange and unexpected their connection was. Then Blake cleared his throat and stepped back. "I'll let you finish getting ready," he said. "The piano has been tuned, by the way." The technician said it's in perfect condition. After he left, Lena sat down on the edge of the bed, suddenly overwhelmed. 2 months ago, she had been cleaning houses 6 days a week, playing piano apps on her phone during bus rides, and trying not to think about all she had lost. Now she was preparing to give a private concert in a millionaire's penthouse, wearing a designer dress and a silver bracelet that probably cost more than a month's rent on her apartment. Life could change so quickly, in ways you never anticipated. By 7 o'clock, the penthouse had transformed into an intimate concert venue. The furniture in the large living room had been rearranged, with the Steinway as the focal point and chairs set up in semicircular rows facing it. Professional lighting had been installed, creating a warm spotlight on the piano while leaving the audience in a flattering dimness. An elegant program had been printed, listing the pieces Lena would play. A journey from Bach to Gershwin, showcasing both classical mastery and jazz influences. Blake greeted each guest personally at the door. Unlike his business dinner, tonight's crowd was diverse: musicians, arts patrons, foundation board members, and a few critics from local publications. Lena watched from the hallway as the seats gradually filled, recognizing a few faces from the charity gala where she'd first played. The woman from the symphony board caught her eye and approached with a warm smile. "Ms. Petrova, I'm so pleased Blake arranged this. We've all been wondering about you since that remarkable night." Lena returned the smile, fighting her nervousness. "Thank you for coming. I hope I won't disappoint. With talent like yours? Impossible." The woman squeezed her arm encouragingly before moving to find her seat. Finally, it was time. Blake stepped into the spotlight to introduce her, his voice carrying clearly through the room without a microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming tonight. Many of you have asked how I discovered Lena Petrova. The truth is I didn't discover her at all. She was right in front of us all along, hiding in plain sight." He paused, looking toward where Lena stood waiting. Sometimes extraordinary talent exists in unexpected places, if we're willing to truly see the people around us. "Please welcome Lena Petrova." The audience applauded as Lena walked to the piano, her heart pounding. She sat down on the bench, adjusted her posture, and placed her hands on the keys. The bracelet caught the light as she moved, reminding her of Blake's unexpected kindness. She took a deep breath and began to play. The first piece was Bach, precise, mathematical, a perfect showcase for her technical training. As her fingers found their rhythm, the familiar calm of performance settled over her. This was what she was meant to do. This was who she was meant to be. From Bach, she moved to Beethoven, then Chopin, each piece flowing naturally into the next. She had chosen music that told a story, from structure and restraint to growing emotion and eventually to joy. The audience was rapt, completely silent except for their breathing and the occasional murmur of appreciation at a particularly beautiful passage. Blake stood at the back of the room, watching Lena with an expression of pride and wonder. This was a different side of him than the shrewd businessman or the arrogant host. Several times during the performance, guests glanced back at him, noting the transformation. When Lena reached the final piece of the first half, Rachmaninoff's Prelude in G minor, the same piece she had played that first night, a ripple of recognition went through those who had been present at the gala. She attacked the dramatic piece with confidence, her hands flying over the keys during the thunderous middle section, before resolving into the haunting conclusion. The applause was immediate and enthusiastic. Lena stood slightly breathless and bowed. As she straightened, she caught Blake's eye. He was beaming at her, clapping louder than anyone. During the intermission, guests gathered around her, offering congratulations and questions about her background. A music professor from the local university pressed a card into her hand, mentioning potential teaching opportunities. The critic from the city newspaper asked for an interview. Through it all, Lena felt a strange sense of homecoming. These were her people, speaking her language, recognizing the years of dedication behind each note she played. Blake appeared at her side with a glass of water. "You're the star of the night," he said quietly. "Just as I knew you'd be." "Thank you for this," Lena replied, equally quiet amidst the buzzing conversation. "For everything." "Don't thank me yet," he said with a cryptic smile. The night's only half over. The second half of the concert was less traditional. Lena had chosen pieces that reflected her journey. Eastern European folk-influenced compositions, jazz standards, and finally, a piece she had written herself during those years when she couldn't access a piano. She had never performed it for anyone, having worked it out in her head and then finally on Blake's Steinway during her practice sessions. As she introduced it, her voice soft but steady, she explained, "This last piece is called After Silence. I composed it during a time when music was only in my memory. Playing it for you tonight feels like coming full circle." The piece began gently, almost hesitantly, with simple melodies that gradually gained confidence and complexity. It incorporated elements of her classical training, but also the emotional rawness of someone who had lost and found themselves again. By the time she reached the triumphant conclusion, there were tears in many eyes throughout the room. The standing ovation lasted nearly 5 minutes. Lena bowed again and again, overwhelmed by the response. Flowers appeared. A bouquet of white roses handed to her by a young woman who whispered, "You've inspired me to start playing again." As the crowd began to disperse, moving toward the dining room where a champagne reception awaited, the symphony board woman approached with a distinguished-looking older gentleman in tow. "Ms. Petrova, I'd like you to meet Richard Harmon, our musical director. He has a proposition for you." The man extended his hand. "Ms. Petrova, that was extraordinary. We're planning a special concert series featuring overlooked talent, and I believe you would be perfect as one of our soloists. Would you consider performing with the symphony?" Lena felt the room tilt slightly. Yes, I would be honored." "Wonderful. We'll be in touch with the details." He handed her his card before being pulled away by another guest. Lena stood alone for a moment, trying to absorb what had just happened. From cleaning houses to potentially performing with the city's symphony in a matter of months, it seemed impossible. Blake approached, 2 glasses of champagne in hand. He offered one to her with a knowing smile. "You heard?" she asked. "I might have had a conversation with Richard last week," Blake admitted, "but he wouldn't have made the offer if you hadn't been brilliant tonight." "And you were." Lena sipped her champagne, studying Blake over the rim of her glass. "Why are you doing all this for me?" Blake looked thoughtful, considering his answer carefully. "When I first made that ridiculous marriage offer, it was just another way to show off. Look at my expensive piano that none of you can play." He shook his head, seeming embarrassed by the memory. "Then you played, and for the first time in a long time I was genuinely moved by something." "Not impressed, moved." He met her eyes directly. "Helping you feels like making amends, I guess, for all the times I've valued things over people." "That's a lot of responsibility to put on one pianist," Lena said softly. "Maybe." Blake smiled. "Or maybe I just like the way you play." Around them, guests continued to celebrate the night a clear success. Lena's future stretched before her, suddenly full of possibilities she had forced herself to stop dreaming about. And beside her stood the unlikely catalyst for it all. Not a fairy godmother or a knight in shining armor, but a flawed, complex man who had stumbled into kindness almost by accident. "So," Blake asked, raising his glass in a toast, "what happens next?" Lena touched the piano charm on her bracelet, feeling both grounded and weightless at once. "I'm not sure," she replied honestly. "But for the first time in years, I'm looking forward to finding out." 1 year later, Lena stood backstage at the city concert hall, her fingers moving silently through the patterns of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. In a few minutes, she would walk onto the stage to perform as a featured soloist with the symphony. The journey from cleaning houses to this moment still felt surreal. The past year had been a whirlwind. After her private concert at Blake's penthouse, opportunities had emerged like spring flowers after a long winter. First came the recording session with a boutique classical label, then the teaching position at the Music Academy, where her students ranged from gifted children to adults rediscovering their passion for the piano. Articles had been written about her unusual story. The refugee concert pianist discovered cleaning a millionaire's home. Someone had even approached her about rights to a movie based on her life, which made Lena laugh every time she thought about it. Through it all, Blake had remained a constant presence. Not controlling or demanding, but supportive in ways that surprised her. He'd attended every performance, sitting quietly in the audience with an expression of genuine pleasure. He'd recommended her to friends and business associates looking for music teachers for their children. He'd even helped her find a better apartment with enough space for the small upright piano she could now afford. Their relationship had evolved in ways neither had expected. The initial awkwardness, wealthy employer and household employee, had gradually given way to something like friendship, and then to something neither quite knew how to define. They were careful with each other, circling around feelings that seemed too complicated to name. A stagehand appeared, clipboard in hand. 5 minutes, Ms. Petrova, Lena nodded, taking a deep breath. Her new concert dress, bought with her own money this time, was a deep green that reminded her of the forests back home. Around her wrist was the silver bracelet with the piano charm that Blake had given her before her first real performance. She'd added 2 more charms since then. A tiny star after her first professional recording and a miniature music note when she'd signed the contract with the symphony. A soft knock on the dressing room door was followed by the appearance of a bouquet of white roses. Blake's trademark gift before every performance. May I come in? He asked from behind the flowers. Of course, Lena replied, smiling at the familiar ritual. Blake stepped into the room, handsome in a dark suit. He'd changed subtly over the past year as well. The sharp edges of his personality had softened. He smiled more easily and listened more carefully. The arrogant tycoon who had mockingly offered marriage to anyone who could play his piano was still visible in glimpses, but no longer defined him. Nervous? He asked, setting the roses beside her other flower arrangements. Always, Lena admitted, but it's a good kind of nervous now. More like anticipation. Blake nodded in understanding. The hall is full. I saw your students in the 3rd row, the ones from your community class. They made a banner, Lena laughed. They didn't. They did. Very colorful. Lots of glitter. Blake straightened his tie, seeming suddenly awkward. I have something for you. Not quite as impressive as a glitter banner, but he pulled a small box from his pocket, similar to the one that had held her bracelet a year ago, but smaller. Lena's heart skipped oddly as he handed it to her. Inside was a charm in the shape of a tiny grand piano, more detailed than the simple one she already wore. It's from the same model as my Steinway, Blake explained. I had it custom made. I thought, well, where it all began, right? Lena felt unexpected tears prick her eyes as she added the charm to her bracelet. It's perfect. Thank you. There's something else, Blake said, his usual confidence wavering slightly. Something I've been wanting to ask you. The stagehand reappeared at the door. Time, Ms. Petrova, they're ready for you. Blake stepped back. Later, he said. Break a leg out there. Lena walked onto the stage to enthusiastic applause. The spotlight was warm on her skin as she bowed to the audience, then to the conductor. As she took her place at the grand piano, she caught sight of Blake in the front row, watching her with that same expression of wonder she'd first seen a year ago. The conductor raised his baton, and Lena placed her hands on the keys. The orchestra began the famous opening chords of the Rachmaninoff, and then Lena joined in, her fingers finding the powerful, emotional notes that had spoken to her since she first heard the piece as a child. As she played, Lena's mind traveled back through the events that had led her here, the revolution that had forced her from her home, the years of struggle in a new country, the night she'd stepped out of the shadows in Blake's penthouse, unable to resist the pull of the beautiful piano. So many chances and coincidences, choices and accidents that could have gone differently. The concerto's second movement brought a more reflective mood, and Lena found herself thinking of Blake. How strange that the most important relationship in her new life had begun with his thoughtless, arrogant challenge. If you play this piano, I'll marry you. Neither of them had taken those words seriously, and yet they had changed everything. By the time she reached the triumphant final movement, Lena was playing not just with technical skill but with her whole heart. The music soared around her, the orchestra and soloist in perfect harmony. This was more than a performance, it was a declaration, a statement about who she was and who she had become. The final chords resounded through the concert hall, and for a moment there was complete silence. Then the audience erupted in applause, rising to their feet. Flowers were thrown onto the stage. The conductor shook her hand with genuine respect. Lena bowed again and again, her heart full to bursting. She found Blake's face in the crowd. He was standing, applauding with everyone else, but his eyes held a message only for her. The reception afterward was crowded with well-wishers, fellow musicians, critics, students, and arts patrons. Lena moved through the room in a happy daze, accepting congratulations and answering questions. The director of the symphony pulled her aside to discuss the upcoming season and the possibility of more solo performances. A representative from a major record label handed her his card. Through it all, Blake kept a polite distance, letting her enjoy her moment of professional triumph. It was only later, as the crowd began to thin, that he approached her again. "That was beyond words," he said simply. "Even better than your audition in my living room." Lena smiled at the memory. "I was terrified that night. I hadn't played for anyone in so long." "Could have fooled me," Blake replied. "You seemed completely fearless." "Not fearless, just determined, I guess." Lena looked around the elegant reception hall, still amazed to find herself here. Life is so unpredictable. "If I hadn't been assigned to clean your penthouse that particular evening, if I hadn't been showing off with that ridiculous marriage challenge," Blake added. They both laughed, comfortable in the shared memory that had once been awkward. "You never did tell me what you wanted to ask," Lena said, remembering their interrupted conversation before the performance. Blake hesitated, suddenly looking as uncertain as she'd ever seen him. "It might be better saved for another time." "Please," Lena insisted. "I'd like to know." Blake took a deep breath. "Well, the thing is, my foundation is expanding its music education program. We're opening a new center in the neighborhood where you teach your community classes. We need a director, someone who understands both the artistic and the practical sides, who can work with students from all backgrounds." He met her eyes directly. "I'd like you to consider taking the position." Of all the things Lena might have expected, this wasn't it. "Me? But I don't have any management experience." "You have something more important," Blake said. "You understand what music can mean to people who've lost everything else. You know how to rebuild a life around art." He smiled slightly. "Besides, the pay is good and you'd still have time for your own performances and private students." Lena was speechless. A year ago, she'd been dusting this man's bookshelves. Now he was offering her a position that could help others like her. People with talent and passion who just needed a door to open. "I know it's a big decision," Blake continued when she didn't immediately respond. "Take some time to think about it." "Yes," Lena said. "Yes, you'll think about it?" "Yes, I'll do it." Lena's mind was already racing with possibilities. Programs they could develop, communities they could reach. "It's perfect." Blake's face lit up with genuine pleasure. "Really? That's wonderful." A comfortable silence fell between them, filled with unspoken understanding. Then Blake cleared his throat. "There's one more thing," he said. "Not a job offer this time." Lena looked at him curiously. "What is it?" "Remember that ridiculous offer I made the night we met?" Blake asked, a hint of his old smirk returning. "About marrying anyone who could truly master my piano?" Lena laughed. "How could I forget? It was probably the most arrogant thing I'd ever heard." "Well," Blake said, his voice growing softer, more serious, "I was wondering if that offer might still be open for negotiation." Lena's laughter faded as she realized what he was asking. "Blake, not right away," he added quickly. "And not because of some stupid challenge. But someday, when you're ready, if you wanted." Lena felt a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with her performance triumph. Carefully, she reached out and took his hand. "I think," she said softly, "that would be worth discussing." Around them, the concert hall was emptying, guests departing into the cool evening. Tomorrow, Lena would return to her teaching, her practicing, her gradually expanding career. Blake would go back to his business empire and philanthropic projects. But something had shifted between them, a possibility, a future neither could have imagined on the night when a cleaning woman had stepped out of the shadows to play a Tycoon's expensive piano. "I never did thank you properly," Blake said as they walked together toward the exit, "for making me look like a fool that night. It was exactly what I needed." "And I never properly thanked you," Lena replied, "for being foolish enough to make that ridiculous offer in the first place." Under the starry sky, they shared a smile. Two people whose lives had collided by chance and connected by choice, creating a harmony neither had expected, but both had come to treasure.